Milwaukee Metropolitan Stewardship District. The title of his presentation is Specifying Plant Materials with an Ecological Sensitivity. Steve?
No one told me that I was going to have to follow up the Robert Frost of the nursery industry. 2 roads diverged in the woods, and I took the one less traveled by. And that's actually worked out pretty well. And it's also a good synopsis of this next presentation, I think. I'd like to thank our host, Johnson Nursery and Seawisk, and all the sponsors who made this forum possible. It's really great to see such a diverse group here, of the diverse group of the landscape industry here, and that's one of the reasons why this forum is taking place, to get all of us together under one tent. And the other reason is to present topics that introduce new ideas, that challenge us to go beyond the status quo. Excuse me. That challenge us to go beyond the status quo. And to encourage interdisciplinary discussion and cooperation, because if there's one thing that I've learned over the past 35 years, it's that partnerships are the key to success. The urban forest has taken a higher profile as environmentalists and municipalities have become more aware of the vital roles this resource serves. Trees not only enhance the aesthetic quality of the landscape, they improve water and air quality, reduce atmospheric carbon, and modify climate. For these and other cultural and environmental reasons, trees are viewed as an asset to our communities. And so the overall practice of urban forestry has received general acceptance without the benefit of substantial public input and debate. Before we go further into this topic, and because we all perceive the landscape differently, based on our educational, personal, and professional experiences, it will be helpful to provide some background about the people and the places and the ideas that have shaped the way I perceive the landscape and have chosen to apply these influences in my professional practice. I like to believe that if you're offering an alternative to the status quo, then you should show examples of how that would work. And part of this presentation, I will do that. The first example is from my private practice. It's a residential project in Winnetka, Illinois. And the second is from my work in the public sector, and that's the reclamation of a sand and gravel pit for a forest preserve district in Libertyville, Illinois. This is a little touchy. Is one of these buttons, does anyone...
Brent, is there anything special touchy with the remote? Either that or otherwise you can just use the other down there.
Yeah, I don't want, there's too many steps to toggle through all of that. Is there anything right here? Yeah, much better.
This is a control made for IBM executives. They said, I only want 3 buttons. That's all I can handle. Forward, backward, and light.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you so much. Well, at the University of Wisconsin in the 1970s, I was fortunate to have studied under 2 exceptional plantsmen and instructors, Ed Hasselkus in the horticulture department for ornamental plants, and this gentleman, Daryl Morrison, in the landscape architecture department for planting design. Daryl taught this course in a unique manner by taking students into the field to observe and sketch native plant communities and to experience nature's design principles of harmony, diversity, and order. Here we see that in place at the Northern Highlands State Park or Forest in northern Wisconsin. And here in Chihuahua Prairie in the southeastern corner of our state. He was the first landscape architect that taught an ecological approach to landscape design. Darryl has had a greater impact on the landscape industry than any other individual that I know. And eventually, people will begin to write about that, and you'll learn much more about him than is what's available today. And this is a landscape restoration at the Morton Arboretum where invasive species like European alder have been removed. It was in this class that I was first introduced to the work of this man, Jens Jensen, Prairie School landscape architect. Jensen was a Danish immigrant that came to the United States, settled in Chicago, and brought with him a love of the land. He spent many hours studying the native landscape, as seen here in these images, which are from his photographic archives. This is Jensen on the right, and his wife Marie, probably out on a weekend jaunt, where he's studying the native landscape. And here, this is a copy of a photograph that he took while he was in the Kettle Moraine area. I'm sure he was looking at issues in this picture here, at issues like the native landscape perspective and texture, how the landscape is pinched in the middle, and then how the space moves beyond from that, leading one onward. His intent was not to copy nature, but rather to express the beauty and of the native landscape and enhance its qualities through artful spatial composition, configuring the play of light and shadow, creating a sequence of experiences, and finally a masterful handling of native flora that resulted in dynamic and ever-changing landscapes. Both Jensen and Morrison intentionally avoided ornamental plants with garish leaf colors or unusual forms, and the highly formal landscape styles inherited from Europe, and opted instead for a more democratic and regional response. Our public landscapes, such as streetscapes, boulevards, parks, parkways, and school grounds, could all benefit from these landscape design, landscape design and tree selections that emphasize these same principles and geographic context. Jensen's career included work in the public sector as superintendent of the West Park System for the city of Chicago, where he designed numerous parks, such as Columbus Park, shown here. And then he went on to private practice, designing estates for wealthy businesses, such as Henry and Edsel Ford, as well as many school grounds, parks, and institutional projects. This is the Edsel Ford estate in Grosse Pointe Shores, Michigan. And this is the Herbert Kurth estate in Mequon, Wisconsin. Jensen was in his 80s when he designed this in 1947, one of his last projects. I photographed this site in 1978 while Mrs. Kurth was still living there and while the house was still existing. Nature's design principles are broad guidelines. They leave opportunity for artistic expression. To be clear, it's not my intent to suggest that it's enough to simply let things go wild, or that all public landscapes exhibit a naturalistic appearance. On the contrary, one of the best urban examples of a stylized landscape that incorporates nature's design principles is landscape architect Dan Kiley's design for the South Garden at the Art Institute in Chicago, where he resplendently captured the spirit of place, or what's known as the genus loci. It features a bosque of stratified native cockspur hawthorn and picturesque honey locust as the primary plantings framing the garden and creating a beautiful oasis-like setting for Laredo Taft's sculpture of the Great Lakes. From the trees selected to the regional significance of the art, to even its axial relationship connecting to architecture across Michigan Avenue, his garden exemplifies all the best in connecting to both the regional landscape and the immediate surroundings of the garden. The native trees that Kylie chose have not only survived 45 years in the heart of downtown Chicago, but have done so in a limited growing medium over a parking garage. This is Lutz Park in Appleton, Wisconsin. Unlike the previous example, plants selected for this park have no relationship to the site, and this is typical for many landscape projects that we see. Here are red vein crabs, crimson king maple, silver linden, ornamental plants that don't relate to the banks here of it's an incredibly beautiful site in the Fox River in Appleton. And this is the private residence that I said I would use as an illustration for native plants. This is the main house that I had designed for the owner in the early 1990s. And I got a call one day from him, and he asked me if he were to buy the house next door and tear it down, could I incorporate that lot into his existing lot? And I said, sure. So he tore the house down, and it's a 1.2 acre lot, and there's 2 rental buildings also on the property. He tore all that down. And you can see there are a lot of trees that are in poor shape here. So here it is after it was completed. And the trees that were used were swamp white oak, red maple, sugar maple, arborvitae, river birch, just all natives. And he wanted to build a house on the lot. And so when he asked me to design this, I kept an area open in the middle for the house eventually, but we didn't want it sitting just in lawn. It was a large area, so I suggested that we put in islands of prairie with flowing turf paths between them, and so that's what you see behind these 3 swamp white oaks here. And here you see it later in the summer. And then the fall color of not just the trees that we see here, of the swamp white oaks and the red maples and the sugar maples and all of that, but also the color of the native prairie landscape. And here you can see, looking from the road back to the main house, how the 2 lots were connected via flowing lawn area, and obstacles like walls and power lines and unsightly trees and stuff were removed in order to make that connection. And then this is the public sector project that I mentioned, 160-acre sand and gravel pit, a hole in the ground, repurposed as a regional forest preserve, featuring a visitor center, beach plaza, 115-acre lake, boating, trails, and a native garden. Other than the lawn areas, all of the plantings on this 200-acre site I specified are native or cultivars of natives. I'm going to do a quick tour through the project. This is the sand and gravel pit in operation. 20 years, called Peterson Sand and Gravel Pit, owned at the Lake County Forest Preserve, getting royalties on everything going out the gate and everything in Cleanfield coming in the gate. This is as the mining is winding down, over 3 million cubic yards of earth were brought in over a period of years to create the topography necessary for the new forest preserve. And you can see the roads and trails under construction here. So this is after it opened right around 2000, and here are aspens that were planted in switchgrass, and I see a hawthorn there. This is Hook's hawthorn, one of probably 6 different hawthorns I used on the project. Cockspur, dotted, downy, plumleaf, a lot of them, maybe 100 or 150. I love hawthorns. Here's Canard juniper. And hackberry in islands in the parking lot underplanted with switchgrass. And on the far right, Patmore ash and the diamonds in the parking lot, because those are extremely difficult conditions to grow in. And this is a photograph of the site 1 year after it was planted. plugs were used in this area here in the front. And the trees that you're seeing are largely white oak. Between 150 and 200 oaks were tree spaded into this site. Some larger ones with a 90-inch, and then smaller ones were tree spaded, put into baskets, and then put on a trailer and hauled over. And here it is today, about 13 years later. I took this photo 2 weeks ago, and you can see just how well these white oaks have thrived under these conditions. Later, we're going to see the inspiration for this, the landscape that kind of caused me to use white oak in this way. I've never seen another man-made landscape with as many white oak incorporated. And now we're inside the preserve, looking across the recreation bay at the visitor center, and you can see things like swamp white oak and autumn blaze maple and all the trees that are thriving there. And then from a high point looking down on the plaza, the sugar maples, swamp white oak, hawthorn, black hog, viburnum, just a wonderful riot of fall color that natives impart. This is a photo taken a couple of weeks ago, and that same pathway leading down to the plaza. And here it is in the fall. And you can use natives in a way where you can create movement and texture in the landscape. Here you see the prairie dropseed following the curve of the path to amplify it. And just more of the rhythm of texture and color that can be imparted with native species. This is a view from that same hillside looking out to the lake with aspens and red maple and hawthorns in fall color. And this is a view from there looking down into the native plant garden. So this is probably autumn blaze on the left, and on the right is a large hawthorn that I had, it actually couldn't be tree spaded, it was too large, so we put one of those large pancake balls on it, used a winch and loaded it on a trailer and brought it over and planted it in the native garden. This is the entrance to the native garden from the plaza under the arbor. And here you are underneath a small structure where lots of people get married here. And they often get married underneath this structure. They have a photo opportunity right there in the garden. And so from May to October, this is booked almost every weekend for weddings. And the reason that I show this is because, again, I want to make it clear that these are just all native plants. It's how you design the landscape that makes it acceptable. It's not whether it's ornamental or native. And here again, the lawn area overlooking Millennium Plaza with the white oaks and seating for when they have concerts. This is a view in the plaza looking through a grove of 38 river birch looking towards the visitor center. And then in reverse, that same view in April. And here we see it just a couple of weeks ago, so early September. Also the pathways leading into the plaza with native trees, river birch, redbud, swamp white oak. And the walkway leading up to the visitor center with a large grouping of hawthorns and redbud. On the left, swamp white oak. On the right, tamarack looking across the recreation Court Bay towards the bridge. I've noticed that these trees seem to have really thrived. I mean, look at the size of the trunk on the swamp white oak. And swamp white oak is just amazing as a street tree. I see it doing really, really well, even in years like last year when we had such difficult dry conditions. White pine that were tree spaded to the site. And then this is a view in the fall of the year. There were some native sugar maples, but also cultivars such as Legacy and one other, I can't remember, Green Mountain or something like that I used. But you can just see the intensity of the fall color and hear how it kind of all blends together. together by using native species. All right, that's the gravel pit. And here we come to a landscape that probably many of you know. This is the Capitol grounds in Madison. And on the right here is Norway maple. When I was a student in Madison, I was on the square one day and I noticed there's Norway maple planted at the Capitol. And I thought to myself, you know, this is an indignity to not just that landscape, but to all of us in Wisconsin. And about 5 years ago, so that was 35 years ago, about 5 years ago, I was reading an essay by Leopold called The Last Stand. It was in 1942. He wrote this at the darkest point of the war. And people wanted to go into, they were recommending us to go into northern peninsula of Michigan and cut down the last stand of the virgin sugar maple forest there to use for the war effort. And this is an excerpt from that essay. I'd like you to take just a moment and read it to yourselves. In addition to those that I've already mentioned, Aldo Leopold has and continues to shape my perception of the landscape. Excuse me. There's a tendency to look at the urban forest as a landscape distinct from the natural landscape of our region, a kind of horticultural free zone where most anything goes and almost all trees are desirable. However, the assumption that all trees, regardless of origin, contribute equally to our urban forest is, I believe, selling native species, our natural heritage, and the overall aesthetic quality of our communities short. Because as Leopold so accurately stated, we make shift with substitutes. This is quintessential Leopold, bringing a new perspective to an overlooked issue and sharing his insights. His pose and his dry wit take us beyond mere horticultural considerations, in this case, to the question of ethical and cultural values as exhibited by the trees we select for our public landscapes. It was out of respect for the native sugar maple and all that it represents that Leopold felt the need to speak out about what he saw as the inane act of planting a substitute Norway maple at the Capitol grounds. Today, these same ill-informed and often arbitrary decisions are made every day when trees are planted in our public landscapes, with these decisions funded by trusting and largely unquestioning taxpayers. According to the Invasive Plant Atlas of the United States, Norway maple has invaded forested ecosystems throughout the Northeast United States and parts of the Pacific Northwest. I also know that it has become invasive in woodlands here in Wisconsin. Additionally, this was one of the main species that replaced American elm in our urban forest. Similarly, many years, for many years, tax dollars were used to fund the planting of Russian olive trees and autumn olives along highways throughout the state. Today, these are invasive plants, and autumn olive is spreading rapidly across the landscape. These are just a few of the invasive species that have been selected and planted in our public landscapes, actions that could have been avoided. Over the years, I've observed a number of tree selections in public spaces that have given me pause. They include a Norway maple memorial tree planted in Door County's magnificent Peninsula State Park, which features a sugar maple beach scientific area. Purple-leaved Norway maples planted at the hallowed ground of Gettysburg National Cemetery. I should say fairly newly planted as well, and the site of Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. To my eyes, they stand out as artifacts amid the solemnity of this historic site, and they're in no way representative of the American watershed event that took place here 150 years ago. European alder, an invasive species planted in a new state park here in Wisconsin, and also shown here in a botanic garden where it could escape and become invasive in an adjacent river lagoon complex. And lastly, non-native trees introduced into an Appleton, Wisconsin landmark park amongst an uncommon extensive canopy of mature white oaks and hickories. I know this park intimately. Excuse me. I have since I was used it since I was a kid, and very familiar with it. And back up for just a second. So here we see in the background are the white oaks and hickories, and in the foreground are the Eurasian elms that have been recently introduced. On the left, you get an idea of how beautiful the native canopy is here. And on the right, you can see where there used to be a skating area, now the encroachment of exotic species has begun. It started with that large spruce tree many, many years ago on the right. And then today, there's red-veined crabs and the Asian elms that I mentioned earlier. Here again, amidst a beautiful native canopy, there was a bit of a sun opening that was planted with Norway maple. This is one of the entrances to the park, just a beautiful entrance, and on either side of that entryway used to be native hawthorns that hung over those walls, and of course they lasted many, many years and then finally succumbed. And well, on the right, it was replaced by ginkgo. Few parks exhibit the beautiful canopy that this park does, and when it's gone, it will be lost forever. It's like a living natural history museum. The same scene is being repeated at parks, campuses, public landscapes of all forms across the country. Instead of being taken for granted, this park should be celebrated and honored as a legacy landscape worthy of a friends group and restoration and preservation efforts. These examples typify planting decision in many of our public landscapes. Tree selections are frequently determined by a plant's aesthetic and cultural characteristics, commercial availability, and all too often, how eye-catching it will appear in the landscape. The individual that added autumn olive to the plant list for Wisconsin highways would have used these same professional guidelines. Urban forestry and landscape professionals seem to view tree choices primarily through a horticultural lens, which is a good place to start, but there may be benefits to broadening the aperture. And here we are at Leopold's quote. I think this is certainly the case in terms of Pierce Park in Appleton, Wisconsin. We're remodeling the Alhambra with a steam shovel, and we're proud of our yardage. Many communities have a list of preferred street trees that are recommended by the landscape industry. They enjoy broad commercial availability, and they exhibit a tolerance for a wide range of urban conditions. And for many municipalities, the current standard regarding what to plant is influenced by the perceived need to maximize diversity, a response to the widespread loss of American elm to Dutch disease. This is the block I live on. There are 17 species and cultivars of trees on one block. This is Esplanade Boulevard in New Orleans. I took this picture about a week ago. And some places still value compositional approach. And you can see the difference in the quality of the experience that it makes. And this is City Park in New Orleans. Esplanade Boulevard terminates here into the City Park. A beautiful way to lead one down to the park. Public landscapes everywhere are an opportunity to preserve and celebrate our natural heritage and provide the sense of place that we all value as we travel from one region of the country to another. But landscape regionalism has suffered as the same exotic trees are repeatedly sold and planted across the country. It's the horticultural and landscape equivalent of the architectural image repeated in towns everywhere, where we see strip malls, mammoth parking lots, and the usual suspects of big box stores. When it comes to selecting trees for urban landscapes, there appears to be a bias towards exotic species and their cultivars, a number of which are purple-leaved. What I've heard from urban foresters is native trees won't grow there, and we plant trees recommended by and available from the nurseries. This is having a deleterious effect, not just on our streetscapes, but it's spilling over into tree selections for parks and other public landscapes by reinforcing the idea that non-native trees are best suited to urban environments. As more and more exotic and novelty trees are planted, our landscapes are taking on an increasingly artificial appearance. This is Lincoln Creek Parkway. That was part of a flood control project that MMSD did in the last 10 years. When I got involved in the project, I looked at the trees that were specified for it from the engineer's plan, and they were all non-native exotics. And so I revised that, and today we have hackberry and red oak and swamp white oak and hawthorn, all of the native species that you would find along a parkway like this. And this is the Olmstedian Boulevard, Newberry, between Lake Park and Riverside Park in Milwaukee. There are 2 rows of Norway maple planted here. And when I look at this, all I can think of is the incredible opportunity that was foregone. So when urban forestry is practiced with an emphasis on non-native trees, it can result in the introduction of invasive species, an arbitrary and visually chaotic assembly of trees along our streetscapes and in our parks. Trees that are seasonally out of sync with the evolutionary time clock of our region, creating late season leaf cleanup problems for municipalities and homeowners. And then finally, the crux of this proposal, which is the loss of regional landscape character. This is an MMSD flood control project. I did not manage it in Wauwatosa at the county grounds. And when novelty is incorporated erratically throughout our public landscape, as exhibited by widespread use of purple-leaf trees, such as crimson king maple, red vein flowering crabs, and various plums, they become a discordant, a visual element rather than part of a composition of the landscape. Mike had actually shown a slide of Swan Boulevard earlier, and wide lawn areas, beautiful hackberries lining the streets, an example of a really excellent streetscape. I think it's important that I define native as I'm using it here in this presentation. The complexities and conditions found in urban forests require that native be defined more broadly than those indigenous trees found in natural plant communities within a limited geographic area. As used here for application for southeastern Wisconsin, it includes indigenous trees found within 150 miles of Milwaukee, along with hybrids and cultivars of those trees. Again, we're working in an urban environment with a lot of difficulties and complexities to deal with. So, as I said earlier, what I've heard is native trees won't grow there, but here we see hackberry growing on Broadway in Chicago, taken about 3 weeks ago. That's a difficult environment. As is this. This is down in Lincoln Park in Chicago. Autumn Blaze maple. Seems to be doing pretty good. And here we see emerald ash borer beginning to take effect. What species will the urban forester and horticulturalist promote as suggested replacements this time? Will preservation of regional landscape character become part of that conversation? If the replacement of the American elm is any indication of the landscape impact that can be expected this time around, it may be in the best interest of all if the topic were well vetted before replacement action begins. Or as the saying goes, when an informed course of action is required, don't just do something, stand there. Tricolor beech. When I see this plant, I see a new marketing wave in the industry based on impulse buying. With many new tree cultivars being introduced every year, there's an ever-expanding list to choose from, and these new uber-ornamental selections can be hard for the landscape practitioner to resist. We have tricolored beech, weeping and purple birches, variegated maples, contorted locusts, dwarf and purple, everything to address all fancies and facets of lifestyle living. But what we don't have is a disease-resistant strain of American elm that's readily available, to the average homeowner at our nurseries and garden centers, despite the fact that they've been available in limited distribution for many years. Only recently have they become more available at wholesale nurseries. Leopold's prescient observation about the Capitol grounds serves as an example for public landscapes in general. These landscapes form the backbone of what is known today as green infrastructure and provide a place where our indigenous natural heritage can be respected and preserved for future generations. We can choose to be the first generation of citizens and green industry professionals to stir our ecological conscience and apply native-first tree selection criteria to these spaces. While most urban forestry programs rely heavily on exotic trees, the proposed native-first approach exemplifies an informed humility and respect towards man's place in nature. In an effort to accelerate discussion about regional landscape character as a priority criterion for selecting tree species for our public landscapes, I've prepared a list of native trees and cultivars of native species, or nativars as Mike calls them, along with an outline of recommended actions. This information is available in an addendum to a more extensive paper that I've written on the subject, and it's available at CWISC's website. This is not a purist approach to selecting species for urban forestry, but rather a conscientious effort that promotes the use of native species and their cultivars as a first option when conditions allow. Additionally, it's not intended to say that non-native trees do not have an occasional place in our urban forest. There are a substantial number of native first options available to the urban forester, landscape architect, and nursery industry, as evidenced in the attached list of native species and cultivars that are suitable for urban conditions. In order for native first urban forestry to be feasible, landscape nurseries would need to work with public officials and landscape professionals to ensure that these species and nativars become and remain readily available. Public attitudes have changed regarding various environmental issues. An example of this is urban stormwater management. 20 years ago, stormwater best management practices were not a concern of municipalities. Today, these practices are mandated. In just 20 years, they're mandated on public and private projects across the country, and government agencies are even educating the public on the role that homeowners can play to address this problem. And this example serves as a contemporary parallel to the ideas proposed here. Re-envisioning the potential of our public landscapes is a resource-friendly concept and requires no economic sacrifice from any industry, nor does it place any additional burden on taxpayers. Like the stormwater example above, government agencies have the opportunity to set a new standard and model that will raise public awareness, particularly in regard to invasive plant species. MMSD has already agreed to be the first public agency to adopt this policy, and I will be rewriting the master specs for that purpose. So, very good, thank you. The following recommendation are recommended best management practices that consider both environmental and aesthetic issues. First of all, I'm recommending that we prohibit the use of all invasive plant species in public landscapes. Invasive here is defined as plants exhibiting invasive qualities occurring within a certain geographic region, such as the Midwest, rather than on a state-by-state basis. State lines are just lines, especially with climate change taking place. Adopt native tree first planting policies, as well as improved planting methods and techniques that enhance tree health and sustainability. Discontinue the use of novelty trees, which includes variegated, red vein, contorted, and other hyper eye-catching aesthetic characteristics. And again, this is only in public landscapes. None of what I've said has anything to do with the private landscape. Plant only native species in our state parks and along our roadways. And last, Creative Friends of our public landscape. It's a group that can identify and nominate historical or botanically significant landscapes. Although Leopold's prescient, insightful, and thought-provoking writings remain as environmentally and socially significant as the day that they were written, and the land ethic that he prescribed is as relevant today as ever. These writings continue to guide and shape our environmental and social conscience as we struggle to balance economic ambitions with ecological realities. Leopold's vision for a community land ethic is his challenge and his gift to us. Pursuit of that land ethic is like a long road, and reassessing our stewardship responsibilities regarding public landscapes would be one more step in that journey. If he were to visit the state capital today, he would be pleased to see that his concerns were heard and that all of the new trees are now native, a fitting and authentic response. That sets an excellent example for other public landscapes across the state. The Wisconsin Nursery Association recently recognized the symbolic importance of native trees on the Capitol grounds and donated a swamp white oak. We also might ask ourselves, what would Leopold think if we were to seize the opportunity and make a paradigm shift whereby municipalities and government agencies embraced new policies that elevated the importance of preserving our regional landscape heritage by enhancing the presence of native trees on our public lands? One can imagine his perceptive mind reflecting on his disheartening experience at the Capitol grounds, and then seeing the ironic humor in the selection of an unfortunate substitute for sugar maple, and how it eventually provided a beneficial message and lesson not previously imagined. The measure of that lesson will be the extent to which we continue to heed his words. Like the shrew, we take our environment for granted while it lasts. And lastly, examine each question in terms of what is ethically and aesthetically right, as well as what is economically expedient. A thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, the stability, and the beauty of the biotic community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise. Thank you.